Greetings, everyone. Today we will talk about a paper that fundamentally changed how we think about generative modeling. Denoising diffusion probabilistic models, published at NeurIPS 2020 by Jonathan Ho, Ajay Jain, and Peter Abil from UC Berkeley. I am Nafisa and I will be presenting with Harsh and Lakshya. Here is our roadmap. We will start with the landscape of generative models as it existed in 2020, then build up the forward and reverse process from scratch. After that, we'll cover the training objective, the neural network architecture, some results, and finally some of the deeper theoretical connections the paper uncovers. So, why did this paper matter? Let us briefly survey where the field of image generation was in 2020. GANs could generate stunning images, but they were notoriously hard to train. Mode collapses was a persistent problem, and they provided no explicit likelihood. VAs were stable to train, but their samples tended to be blurry. Normalizing flows gave us exact likelihoods but imposed severe constraints on the network architecture. Autoregressive models like Pixel CNN had the best log likelihoods but were painfully slow to sample from. You had to generate one pixel at a time. So there was a real gap. No single approach gave us training stability, high sample quality, tractable likelihoods, and a flexible architecture all at once. DDPM achieves an FID score of 3.17 on Cypher 10. That's better than most conditional models at the time, including Big GAN, which scored around 14.73. And it does this unconditionally with a remarkably simple training trick. Let's build up the model from scratch. The first key idea is the forward process. Let us imagine that there is a picture and we add noise to it step by step. As we increase the number of steps, the amount of noise in the picture increases, and at the final step, we find that the picture is nothing but static noise. This is called the forward process and it is denoted by Q. The reverse process is just the opposite of it, taking it from xt to x0 and is denoted by p theta. The forward process is a Markov chain. Each step depends only on the previous one, and crucially, it has no learnable parameters. The transition at each step t is given by given x at time t minus 1, produce x at time t by scaling the input down slightly and adding a small amount of Gaussian noise with variance beta t. Beta t is the noise schedule, and we'll look into that later. Now, here is the mathematical trick that makes training tractable. Instead of simulating all 1000 noisy steps one by one, we can jump directly to any time step t in a single computation. Q of xt given x0 equals a Gaussian with mean root alpha bar t times x0 and variance 1 minus alpha bar t. Let me decode that. Alpha t is just 1 minus beta t, the amount of signal that survives one step. Alpha bar t is the cumulative product of all alphas from step 0 to step 1 to step t. So the formula says that the noisy image at step t is just a blend of the original image scaled by root alpha bar t plus pure noise scaled by root 1 minus alpha bar t. As t grows towards 1000, alpha bar t shrinks down towards 0, so the original image disappears. As t approaches 0, it approaches 1, recovering the original image. Let us look at some real values of alpha bar t so that we have a better understanding. We can see that by step 500, only 29% of the signal survives, and by the time we reach step 1000, it is essentially 0. Now, we said that beta t is the noise schedule, and the paper uses a linear schedule, increasing it from 10 to the power minus 4 to 0.02. A small value of beta t is necessary so that in each forward step, only a tiny amount of noise is added. This ensures that the reverse step is approximately a Gaussian. Now, for the part we actually learn. The reverse process p theta is also a Markov chain, but this time it runs backward from pure noise toward a realistic image. Each reverse step is modeled as a Gaussian. Given x at time t, produce a distribution over x at time t minus 1, parameterized by a learned mean mu theta and a fixed variance sigma t squared times the identity. We notice that the variance is not learned. This is a deliberate design choice, and we'll see in the ablation results that learning it actually hurts and it causes unstable training. The two sensible choices for sigma t squared are beta t or beta tilde t. Empirically, they both perform similarly, and the paper chooses beta t as sigma squared t.
So our goal is basically to maximize the likelihood of the data that we have. But it gets computationally impossible to go ahead and do that directly. If we talk about, like, let's say predicting a log p of x, then the integral form of it is basically p x from 1 to t dx 1 to t. Integrating this entire thing over a very high dimension is basically very difficult to go ahead and do. So what we go ahead and do instead is we try to maximize the elbow function that we have, which is something that we do have a bit experience about from the VA derivation that we did during our lab class. So if we have to look into the form which the elbow function takes, is basically we can find three different terms over here: LT, LT minus one, L naught. So if we have to understand each of them and like what kind of significance they have, then we can look at it in this way, that if we look at LT, then it basically is kind of a constant term because it measures the KL divergence between our final noise step and a standard Gaussian prior. Since the schedule that we are talking about over here is fixed, we don't actually need to train this particular part. Talking about L0, so basically this is simply a reconstruction term which makes sure that the final result is a clean discrete image, and it basically is kind of a Gaussian between is kind of a KL divergence between the two Gaussians, and it has a closed form because, like, we can, like, this can be proven that the KL divergence between two Gaussians takes a closed form equation, which means that it can be solved analytically. Talking about the LT minus one term, the LT minus one term is basically, it compares the true reverse transition in terms which it calculates using the Bayes rule, which are with our model transition. The formula for the true posterior is q xt minus 1 given xt x0, which is basically which is basically the first term, and like is essentially a Gaussian, whereas the other term also does follow a Gaussian curve, and which means that this particular KL divergence can be solved analytically. Now looking at the mu t equation which is given over here for x0, we can try thinking of it as the weighted average of the initial image that we of the initial image that we have and the noisy image, which is xt. It is kind of the weighted average between xt and x0, which for like, I mean, technically we don't have x0 while trying to generate the real image from the noisy image, but we can try thinking of a substitution over here. That substitution looks like if we replace x0 by some sort by 1 by under root alpha t xt minus under root 1 minus alpha t epsilon, where epsilon is the noise that we will be trying to predict in future. So then then if we go ahead and plug this particular x0 function in the initial mu t function that we have, then the mu theta equation simplifies into this particular form that is mentioned in slide 9 under in the blue box, which basically, just a second, let me try to bring it up. Uh, Once we go ahead and do this, it looks like huh, it looks like one by under root alpha t x t minus beta t by under root 1 minus alpha t epsilon theta t. And so now now instead of guessing the whole image, the network that we have has the job of guessing the noise, which is essentially what the DDPM paper suggests, that we try that instead of trying to predict the instead of trying to predict the entire image, we are now going to focus more on predicting the noise, which has a much more systematic form. Now coming to the next slide, uh, which is about like trying to simplify the training objective that we have, because like if we talk about the elbow function that we saw on slide 8, it suggests that every step has a different weight. But when the author tried solving this analytically, they were able to discover that if we ignore these weights and try uh, if we try treating each and every step as equally important, the result gets better, which basically leads us to this particular equation in which the loss function gets simplified to a simple expectation of an L2 norm, which is basically the predicted which is basically the error that exists between the noise that we are trying to predict. And that is how essentially things have changed from the original original loss functions, where we were trying to compete assign different weights to a model in which we are assigning equal weights to each and every step. And uh, uh, the trade-off over here is that like L simple gives us better sample quality, whereas the original loss function that we defined earlier gives a better log likelihood that we were trying to predict. But we'll see how that is something that we are okay with having over here. Now moving on to the next slide. Just a second. Yeah. So now training and sampling. Let's discuss the training and sampling algorithm that we have. Um, so in terms of training, what we go ahead and do now is we take a clean image, pick a random time step t, and add random noise epsilon to it. We then train our network, e theta to predict that specific noise that we have randomly added. And then we use the MSE loss function in order to optimize over the loss that we are getting in terms of the noise that we are predicting about. That is how we go about the entire training step of it. Now bringing it to the sampling step, what we go ahead and do is let's say let's say now we'll talk about how we generate a new image. So our goal is basically to maximize the likelihood of the data that we have. But it gets computationally impossible to go ahead and do that directly. If we talk about, like, let's say predicting log p of x, then the integral form of it is basically px from 1 to t dx 1 to t. Integrating this entire thing over a very high dimension is basically very difficult to go ahead and do. So what we go ahead and do instead is we try to maximize the elbow function that we have, which is something that we do have a bit experience about from the VAE derivation that we did during our lab class. So if we have to look into the form which the elbow function takes, is basically we can find three different terms over here: LT minus one, L naught. So if we have to understand each of them and like what kind of significance they have, then we can look at it in this way, that if we look at LT, then it basically is kind of a constant term, because it measures the KL divergence between our final.
Now that we have looked at the forward and reverse processes and also at the loss function, we need to build a network to predict the noise. For that, the authors chose the unit architecture. So the unit architecture is an encoder-decoder architecture where the encoder shrinks the image down to some size, let's say 16 cross 16, and then the decoder expands it back up. So the encoder basically recognizes the overall shape of the image, and there are also skip connections between the encoder and to the decoder This allows the network to combine the big picture concepts with the local details. This is what we mean by operating at multiple scales. We concatenate the multiple inputs from encoder directly and also by upsampling the encoder's final output. In the diffusion model, we use group normalization and not batch normalization because high resolution image generation would require massive GPU memory, and therefore only one or two images could be in a batch, and therefore we use group normalization and not batch normalization. Just like in case of transformers, we use position embedding here, where we add some quantity that is the embedding based on the time step of the model. So we add some sinusoidal and some cosine values based on the time step, and these are concatenated and added to each of the residual blocks in the unit. Then the authors have also implemented self-attention at the 16x16 size, which allows every pixel to look at every other pixel, and hence we can gauge the complete image using this. Also, we share all the parameters across all the time steps, and we don't make different units for each of the time step, because this reduces the number of parameters, which could have been billions, and also this makes the model learn a more generalized representation of the noise. Now coming to the Cipher 10 results, the IS inception score measures the clarity of the image and also the diversity of the image, like if different types of cars, animals are used in the image or not. The FID, or the Frechet inception distance, measures the statistical resemblance of the generated image with the original image. So we want IS to be as high as possible and FID to be as low as possible. So if we compare the values, we find that IS is quite high for our model, and it is almost the best one among all the models. And FID is also quite low for our model. But we see that there is a trade-off in NLL, which is the negative log likelihood, which basically means the compressibility of our model is worse than the other models. Now the authors have also performed an ablation study on the model. So they tested the model based on different mathematical targets. First, we see if the network should predict the reverse mean or it should predict the noise. So predicting the mean gave us FID of 13.2, while predicting noise gave a much better FID of 3.17. So this basically drastically improved the performance, and this was because mean changes drastically depending on the time step, whereas noise is just randomly a standard normal noise. So it is quite consistent in its value, and it is much more predictable than the mean, because mean changes much more than the noise in the given architecture. Also, the authors tested the model with variance as a parameter, and this brought instability in the training and the noise prediction case. Also, as we see in the loss terms, the loss has the KL divergence term, the DKL of Q and P. So, which means it would be better if both the Q and P distributions were as close as possible. So we would prefer that the variance for both of them is the same. When variance was taken to be same in forward process, we see the results, but better results were obtained when the weights were removed from the losses. The term which was beta t square by 2 sigma square, if that term was removed, we see the results were much better, and this is called the L simple loss. So this is because if we look at the loss expression, the weights are higher for the initial time step images, which makes the model try to predict more of higher frequency noise, and hence the low frequency noise is not correctly predicted, leading to a worse output. So the initial reconstruction itself won't be proper, and hence the final reconstruction is quite bad. Now these were some of the models on which the authors have run. These are some of the data sets on which the authors have run the model, and their descriptions are given, and some of the FID scores are given. We also see that the model can be easily interpolated. That is key. We can easily take two images and run the forward process on them, and then interpolate the latent vector. For example, like 20% of image 1's latent vector and 80% of image 2's latent vector can be taken. And then when we decode this, the output tends to be quite smooth and not just distorted, which means the model doesn't just learn the trained dataset, but it learns the features of the dataset and works on that. It is seen that GAN models generally are considered bad at times because they tend to learn the training dataset itself, but they don't learn the features. So this is not the case in our diffusion model. In information theory, we can just consider this model to be just a compression algorithm. We can split our variational bound into two parts: the rate and the distortion. So the rate consists of the losses L1, L2, and up till LT, which is the constant. LT is the constant loss, whereas others are dependent on the noise that we have predicted. So these are the rate, and the distortion is L0. So for the Cipher 10 model that we have, we obtained the rate to be 1.78 bits per dimension, and for the distortion, we obtained 1.97 bits per dimension. This means that more than half of the network's code length is spent on describing high frequency pixel distortions, which are at the end of the reverse process. So this means the Gaussian diffusion models act as highly effective progressive lossy compressors because they have a stronger bias towards perceptual quality rather than finer details. So, and also this is the justification for using the L simple loss and not the one which had the variance term. Because if we drop the variance, if we drop the weights, that basically tends to increase the loss bias on the initial time steps only, because the initial time steps have a higher weight if we look at the expression. Now we will try to relate the autoregressive models to diffusion models. Like we know, autoregressive models are the ones where we predict the next pixel based on the previous pixels. So if, for example, an image has 1000 pixels, we can set our total time steps to be 1000, and instead of adding Gaussian noise to the whole image, we just add Gaussian noise to a particular pixel. So because of this definition, now the reverse process will also have to predict the tth pixel given the rest of the image. So this means that autoregressive models are just a generalized form of the diffusion models, are just a subset of the diffusion models. I mean. The autoregressive models also decode an image in a raster scan order, and whereas diffusion models use a Gaussian noise schedule, where they tend to work in a smoothness based order of the image. And even without a coordinate aligned bit ordering, they can generalize autoregressive models. To conclude, this paper achieved a theoretical unification. The authors proved that the variational inference, the Langevin dynamics, the rate distortion of information theory, and the maths of denoising score matching are all the same underlying process. This was the first paper to show diffusion models can generate high quality images. Also, but we must acknowledge the fact that this has a quite slow sampling speed, which is due to 1000 passes through the unit, hence making the model slower than GANs. But this paper became the direct backbone for modern systems like stable diffusion, midjourney, etc. Thank you.